Now on BBC One, See Here tackles one of the most controversial issues facing the deaf community.
Hello and welcome to a rather special edition of See Here. We don't quite know what's going to happen because it's a debate on a hot, controversial issue, led by two people with strong views on the subject of deafness and disability. The two people are Paddy Ladd, who thinks of deaf people as having a minority language rather than a disability, and Vic Finkelstein, who thinks that deaf people are very much part of the disability movement, or at least should be. With us in the audience are a group of people, some of whom have been specially invited to take part, as well as a number of others who we hope will have some interesting points to make. So let's start with Paddy. Over to you, Paddy. Thank you, Clive. First of all, congratulations to See Here on arranging this debate, because I think it's extremely important. And I hope that people with disabilities will listen to what I've got to say, and we can all listen to each other, and in the end, decide what we should do in the future. Stick together, or if we decide to work together, how? And my role, really, is as a representative of the deaf view from past days right through up until today. Deaf people, I think, are a linguistic minority, and this means that we have our own language, BSL, which is the fourth most widely used language in the country. Deaf people tend to marry each other, 80% of them anyway. Many of them want deaf children. We have a history that goes back about 200 years. We have deaf clubs, deaf schools, deaf sports organizations, and so on. And at the same time, we have a wonderful social life where deaf people get together on a grassroots level and have a terrific time, and feel very strongly identified with that. But I think the number one thing is education. If you have a child who is born deaf, he's going to be very isolated and lonely, and the way he builds up his confidence is through being together with other deaf people at school. And for the last 200 years, we had deaf schools which maintained that tradition. And then we had the Warnock Report in 1981. The Education Act came about too, which meant integration, and deaf schools began to close. Now, we said to other people with different disabilities, we don't want to be involved in that really, and if you support us, we can help you. But they said, no, we want to be separate. And that was obviously a problem for us. Then the National Union of the Deaf wrote a Charter of Rights of a Deaf Child in 1982. And we were looking into the United Nations Charter of Rights for People with Disabilities. And that didn't really help us. Then we looked at the Charter of Rights from the UN for Linguistic Minorities, and that really did work for us. And we decided to go with that. And the National Union of the Deaf also felt that if we have disabled legislation, then we should have something about linguistic minorities within that. And the linguistic minority legislation should also have something about disability in it. Now, so far, we've concentrated a great deal on disability and very little on linguistic minorities, and our aim is to change that priority and make the linguistic minority important. Paddy, thank you very much. Well, there's some good points to think about there. But hold on to what you've thought, and let's now turn to Vic and see what Vic has to say.
First of all, I think it's very important to accept that every group, every social group that struggles against discrimination has the right, or ought to have the right, to determine its own identity and how it's labelled and what it's called. And we know that as movements grow of oppressed groups, that one of the first things they do is look back at the history of the struggles to see how members of that group have tried to establish its identity and in many ways to rediscover what that particular group has suffered and to develop its own identity. One of the things about disability generally is that disabled people have not had that right to determine the way in which they are seen and the way in which we are labelled and what we are called. So the term disabled then has been very much decided by able-bodied people and is by and large meant that we are not like they are, like able-bodied people. Now, nearly every disabled group, as far as I can make out, has rejected that approach to disability, to what it means to be a disabled person. It seems to me that there are a number of ways you can deal with that. One is that you can accept the lot that's imposed on you and become rather passive. And sometimes people use the passive way of struggling against that imposition. The second way, it seems to me, is you can reject the idea that disabled people are basically broken able-bodied people or impaired able-bodied people. And when you reject that, you also reject the labels that they have given to that label that disabled people are broken able-bodied people. You reject that label and distance yourself from that label. So what you then do is use terms like linguistic minority and say we're not disabled. But the term disabled is not the term that's coming from the disabled community. It is the term that's coming from the able-bodied community.
Vic, thank you very much indeed. Well, there are the issues, very important and very controversial, and I'm sure that both Paddy and Vic would like to respond to each other. But before that, I'd like to bring in our studio audience. And first I'd like to call on Jane Campbell from BOCDP. She's the co-chair, and that's an umbrella organisation of disabled groups. Now, Jane, what's your view of what you heard so far?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to point out that it's not a them and us situation. There are deaf people within the disability movement, and there are numbers of increasingly becoming more and more. Indeed, Austin Reeve, Vice Chair of the BDA, the British Deaf Association, is a representative on our council. I think, as Vic said, since about 1975, our political movement of disabled people has been growing and developing, and we've had to change our minds on lots of things as every movement goes through its liberation. And certainly, we would say that we are disabled due to social and economic and environmental barriers, i.e. our discrimination comes from the society in which we live and not from our various impairments. And if we tackle the issue in this way, we will see that all disabled people, which include, in my belief, deaf people, face the same issues of lack of housing, no employment rights, with the fact that we are prevented from having proper relationships. We face the same barriers. So we believe that we are coming together under the issue of civil rights.
Jane, thank you very much. Now, I'd like to come to you, Francis Elton. What's your particular view, your response?
Okay, I'd like to ask Vic. Now, you wrote a book for Open University about deafness. Now, do you accept BSL as a language? Which I think you do, but you don't accept that deaf people are a linguistic minority as other minority linguistic groups. You don't see other linguistic minority groups as disabled. So why do you see deaf people, even though they're a linguistic minority, as a disabled group?
John Wilson, you have something to say. Well, I think the label of disabled is useful if you're going to get help from it, but we haven't. I mean, if we have this label as someone who's disabled, the way hearing people see us is then in a negative way. If I say I'm deaf and I need help, it doesn't help. But if we talk about being a linguistic minority, it's much better. We say, I'm sorry, I can't understand you. And if you want to organise understanding, you have to accept our language. And that's the difference between us, is a linguistic one. Now, can I come to you, Mary? Well, my view, I mean, I've had experience of being involved in going to a council recently, which was a council for disability. And we were talking about whether we were a disability group or not. And they were talking about how much it would help if we were. We'd get access to all kinds of things. And I kept saying, no, we're actually a linguistic minority. And these are our needs. And I don't think I was being listened to, really. I really was wasting my time there. And I am a deaf person. I'm not a disabled person. And I really feel very strongly about that. So what's wrong with this term disabled? Why are people feeling so strongly against being labelled disabled? Well, I want to respond to Vic's point about being labelled disabled and identity. I mean, I have my own identity. I belong to a culture and a linguistic group. If I'm deaf with a big D, if I'm deaf with a small d, then I'm disabled. There are some deaf people who feel that they are disabled people, but I think those who identify with the deaf community, those with a big D, if you like, don't want to be labelled disabled. We're a linguistic minority. We have our own language, BSL. We're not disabled people. It really confuses the issue for us.
One of the problems is that disability, the word disabled, has had very bad publicity over the centuries and has come to mean something very, very negative. People think of disability as something negative. When I walk down the street, people look at me. When you start signing in a place where people aren't used to seeing signing, people stare at you. If you talk in what is seen to be a funny way, people stare, people ask questions. The same things happen to disabled people. I think we've got that in common, and that's what actually links us, is our experience of life.
Well, I want to respond to that question, what do we mean by disability? If you look it up in a dictionary, disabled means less able to, end of story. And if hearing people join the deaf community, they can't communicate, are they then therefore disabled? There's the confusion, isn't there? And again, we have a culture which is different. People with disabilities have no culture of their own, and it's becoming a problem about money. I mean, we're talking about, you know, somebody trying to decide which is the cheapest way to deal with us all. Well, can I ask you a question, Mika? You're saying that if deaf people go into the hearing community and deaf people don't understand, are deaf people therefore disabled? No, that's their problem, because they can't sign. Yes, June.
Now, I can't understand the point why hearing people call us disabled. Hearing people have two ways, able-bodied, you've got various disabled people, but hearing people, you don't call them disabled, they're able-bodied. Okay, we're deaf. You've got deaf people that are living with wheelchairs. These are disabled people. But because we're just deaf, we're both groups labelled as one.
Now, what's interesting here is that all the deaf people here seem to be quite happy to be part of a separate group, which is a linguistic minority. And it seems that perhaps you're trying to force deaf people to join the disability movement. Now, why should they do that? I mean, there seems to be a great deal of dissension anyway within the disability movement. And Paddy was pointing out the rights we want. We want recognition as a linguistic minority. We're being refused that. Disabled people themselves are not letting us have that. Why is that?
I think that's a misnomer, and I think that the whole debate tonight shows for me the confusion and the lack of communication that there has been between the deaf culture, if you like, and the disability movement. But in saying that, I don't think that there has to be a problem around saying that deaf people are a linguistic minority, but are also disabled people. Because just as Elspeth just said, there are a number of issues that deaf people face on a day-to-day basis, and that is the discriminatory attitude of people who are hearing.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Now, Paddy, a question for you. Well, it's interesting what people are saying, that they want deaf people to be part of this, but you're being very defensive about that as a group. Do you think, therefore, that deaf people are probably too inwardly focused? Good question, yeah. I need time to think about that one, I'm afraid. No, I don't think that. I mean, you can argue that deaf people don't have access to information about disabilities anyway, because they have difficulty reading it. There isn't much in the way of video access. I can see in the last 10 years that that's improved, and I'm happy to have seen that myself and observed that happening in terms of deaf people getting involved in disability arts, deaf people getting involved in disabled television. I like that, that's good. But as someone back there said, where deaf people do try to get involved, they have problems, and people have difficulty understanding their point of view. And maybe we are inwardly focused because of that. Well, I'd like to respond to that. Disability groups are discriminated against, yes, but they're not the only people. There are women and other people who are discriminated against. They don't join with the disability movement, so why should we have to? We are a linguistic minority, and that's quite clear, and everybody can understand that. And I think if you can accept that point, fine. And if we say we're disabled, people are going to get confused as to what deaf people are, and we're going to lose something that way, I think. And our future's not going to be what we want it to be.
I've come here thinking that there needn't be an argument, and I found myself in an argument. I don't think any of us from the hearing side of this argument would doubt that the deaf people are a linguistic minority. That is not at stake here. The fact that the hearing community doesn't speak your language, that disables you. Just like I'm disabled by not being able to get on a bus.
Now, this word disabled really started being used more after the Second World War. And it was after that that we were labelled disabled as deaf people. And all we wanted was better access, more interpreters, subtitles on television and so on. Now, there are 7 million odd people with a hearing problem in the country. And hearing people are trying to label us all the time as part of something that we're not. We are deaf people and we're fine. Now, Francis, a lot of deaf people have been saying things like, I'm a deaf person, and I have pride as a deaf person. I'm an independent person as a deaf person. I'm equal to any hearing people. Do you think that deaf and hearing people are equal now?
They're not equal yet. They're still being discriminated against. Mainly because Britain hasn't recognised sign language as a language. It has been recognised in certain parts of Europe. It's the 4th most used language in Britain, but it's still not recognised. And when it is recognised, then I'm sure we'll be seen on more of a par with hearing people. It's quite a shock, actually, to us. I mean, we're healthy people. We don't want to be labelled disabled. Our only problem is communication or difference.
I feel that I'm a deaf person and not a disabled person. Because my problem is not a visible one. I can do more or less anything. I have access on the phone through a minicom, to television through subtitles, unlike people with a visual problem. People in wheelchairs can't play things like football very well. I can. I'm perfectly fit enough to play football. I have a healthy body. If I was deaf and in a wheelchair, then yes, I would have a disability. But I'm not.
I get a bit worried about the use of the word disability, because the fact of communication and that people need to actually communicate to one another. And the thing is that I actually come across to other people who are hearing, and I can't communicate with them. That's the disability. It's not the communication. It's not the community. It's the communication side that actually limits us out. And that makes us disabled in a way. And really, we're talking about the same thing. The language and the disability, they're both the same thing. We are disabled because of communication access.
Yes. Again, I think there's this massive confusion as to the term disabled. I'm very worried about the terms that I'm hearing. I'm healthy, I just can't hear. Are people saying that we're not healthy? The thing is, we're not sick. We do not consider that the thing that disables us is our impairment or our health. What we consider that disables us is the social factors that oppress us and the attitudes. Again, can we get to grips with this issue about, do deaf people think that disabled people are sick? Do they think disabled people are disabled by their conditions? If they do, then they have the same attitudes as the non-disabled community, which imposed this upon us. We do not agree with that definition. This is what we've got to get straight.
Mary, okay. Well, no, we deaf people are not trying to put down disabled people at all. I mean, it's the government is doing that rather than us. I mean, you see us as deaf people, fair enough. We see you for what you are, fair enough. But, you know, we are deaf people, and that's all there is to it. And that's how we want to be known. And if you want to get rid of the term disabled, fine.
First of all, I think there's no question that we regard people who use British Sign Language as members of a linguistic minority. And I have no difficulty in seeing people being members of several groups. The question for us really is, how do we advance our struggle to gain equality? What is the system on which we should gain that equality? And how should we identify ourselves in order to achieve that goal that we have? One of the things that I'm not getting from the speakers who are saying they're deaf and not disabled is exactly what do they mean by being disabled?
Now, Victoria Scott, you went to America recently doing some research into legislation over there, anti-discrimination legislation. Do they have the same problems over there, linguistic minorities and disabled groups, as we do here?
In America, deaf people joined together with the entire disability community to struggle for the Americans with Disability Act, which gives deaf people and disabled people in general anti-discrimination legislation. And in fact, deaf people, especially the students at Gallaudet University, played a really important role in getting this legislation through. Although they may consider themselves part of a linguistic minority, they identified the discrimination that society placed on them and decided to join forces to fight against that.
Yes, can I come to you? Well, we have a minority language in the same way that Asian people and others do. They need interpreters just in the same way that we do, and it's language. I mean, the only thing I need to tell people is that I'm deaf and I have a communication, linguistic problem. As soon as I say I'm disabled, they label me in a different way, which confuses the issue for me. And I don't want that. My only problem is we have a different language. So you don't want deaf people to be part of the disability movement, is that right? Well, yes. I mean, it's a good point. But on the other hand, maybe the disability movement can help us. I mean, one example, so what do you want? Do you want to be part of it or not? No, I don't.
The thing that concerns me is that if we don't join forces in the struggle to get anti-discrimination legislation, then my worry is that the deaf community will lose out yet again. Thinking back to what was said by Paddy at the beginning, where the deaf community looked at different charters for progress in terms of equality and found it was very difficult to find it. I'm worried that if they don't come on board, or we find some consensus in developing anti-discrimination legislation for all people who are disabled by society, then they'll miss out again and will be left floundering.
It's very much a political issue. Deaf people have just really got to grin and bear it and get involved with the disability unit perhaps, so that they can become our voice. I mean, as we are on our own, we don't have a very strong voice. And perhaps we're going to have to rely on the disability movement because they do have an established voice already.
I mean, I've just been living in America for a year and I've seen how ADA works over there. And for an example, it helps deaf people to get access, provides minicoms and so on. It gives access to theatre for deaf people. And deaf people, as Francis said, are learning to get involved and put up with it. But education is still not included. Deaf children are still not being educated the right way. They're still being discriminated against in that way. And, you know, I think that is sad. But this is a true reflection of deaf people, and we have to face this. The legislation only half helps deaf people. It doesn't cover our language yet. And so far we've been fighting ourselves, and other linguistic minorities haven't helped us. Some of the aims that disabled people want are fine. We can fight together on some of those things, possibly. I mean, both groups have to get together and carry on talking to each other. Vic, final comment from you.
Well, I'm really concerned about some of the stereotypes of disability that some members of the deaf community are putting forward about disabled people. It is a big concern, and it is a reflection of our lack of communication and discussion. It's been pointed out that the deaf community has a long history of struggle in developing a culture. Now, from my point of view, if that is true, what I would expect is that the deaf community plays a leading role in the disability community to clarify what identity we need, and to actually to lead the struggle, rather than for us to find that we're communicating across as though we're two different communities.
Vic, thank you very much indeed. Well, that's the end of what I think has been our very first ever full half-hour discussion program. We hope you enjoyed it and found some point in it to make you think. That, after all, is what it's all about. To challenge assumptions and open the mind to new ideas. There are going to be more programs like this in the future. But before we say goodbye, there's just one important piece of information. Next Tuesday is Budget Day, and we have a special budget program. It will be on BBC Two late at night, and of course it will be in sign language and with subtitles, especially produced by us for you. So make a note of it in your diaries. Tuesday, November the 30th, BBC Two, 10 past midnight. See you then. Bye-bye.